So when I was in college, there was one semester that a roommate and I, we both really liked movies. And so what we would do, we didn't get near as much snow and ice as we tend to get up here. But there in Joplin, there'd be about one storm a year where we would miss a day or two of classes. And we would do this thing called Snow Day Star Wars. And we would watch every single Star Wars episode in episodic order, not the order of release. I know I'm terrible for that. But and we would just leave our dorm room open for everyone to watch those movies, all 6 of them at that time. I'm not that young, but I'm also not quite old enough to where there were only 3. But we would just leave our dorm room open and we would just watch all 6 of the Star Wars movies over the course of any given snow day. I was actually thinking about that this week as I was prepping this message. And I thought, one of the most unsettling things in the Star Wars universe isn't the story of Anakin turning to Darth Vader. I know if you haven't seen those movies, I'm going to spoil it for you. That's okay. They've been around for plenty of years. It's actually Chancellor Palpatine. Okay? Before we jump any farther in, we're going to be hovering in Matthew 5 this morning, if you want to flip there. So at the beginning of this Star Wars series, like I said, the prequels, not the actual beginning in the, late 70s, early 80s. Palpatine, he's not clearly evil. Right? He's calm, he's reasonable, and he's influential. He doesn't take the galaxy over by force. He does it by position, he does it by trust, and he does it by quiet influence. And by the time everyone realizes who he really is, the damage is already done. Influence always reveals what's underneath. Influence always reveals what's underneath. The question is never whether someone has influence. It's what the influence is shaping people into. Jesus, he says the same thing in our passage this morning, just with different words. If you don't hear anything else this morning, I hope it's this that you take away. We influence the world so that Christ is visible in us. We influence the world so that Christ is visible in us. Like I said, we're in Matthew 5. If you want to turn there, I'm just going to go ahead and read, starting in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So we're talking about mission this week. And I want us to realize as we go through this series on what the church is, on ecclesia, that mission, it begins with identity, not with instruction. Mission begins with identity, not with instruction. Jesus, he doesn't say that we have to try to be the salt of the earth. He doesn't say that we should work toward becoming the light of the world. He says that you are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world. Mission flows from who we already are through Christ. Think about salt. We use it today to season food, but in the early days, before refrigeration and before deep freezes and before vacuum seals, salt would be used to preserve meat and other goods from decaying. It would make the food more palatable, more usable for a longer period of time, not in a luxurious way, but in a way that made realistic sense to extend the shelf life of the livestock or the produce, the livestock that was butchered or the produce that was harvested. Like I said, refrigeration, it didn't exist. So salt didn't make meat fancy. It literally just kept it from rotting. So when Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth," he's saying three things at once. Firstly, he's saying that our world is already in a state of decay. Our world's already in a state of decay. In his writing, The City of God, Augustine, he teaches that the flood of the Old Testament represents a moment of total moral decay. The first moment of total moral decay in the history of mankind. And then, when the world was on the brink of another total moral failure, Christ came as its redemption. Meanwhile, Tolkien, you know him from The Hobbit, from The Lord of the Rings, he describes the incarnation of Christ as the ultimate eucatastrophe, which is this sudden and unexpected turn toward hope at the moment of humanity's greatest darkness. In other words, Tolkien says that Christ came when humanity was at its absolute worst. See, salt only makes sense in that analogy, though, if one, decay is real, two, corruption is present, and three, if left alone, things get worse. We tend to soften it to this, but Jesus isn't saying that the world is basically fine and it just needs some inspiration. No, he's absolutely saying that apart from God's kingdom, decay is inevitable. Decay is inevitable. It's not if, but when. Salt, it doesn't create life. All salt does is slow death. That's a truth that would have landed, and it would have landed hard to the people along that mountainside that Jesus is talking to. It's a truth that still lands for us today. Salt works by being present within, not apart from. It preserves only when it's in contact with or when it's mixed in with something else. I mean, salt on the shelf doesn't do anything, right? So Jesus, he's imploring his followers, be in proximity to the broken, be engaged with the world. He says, be present without absorbing the decay the world has to offer. He implores his followers to do that not just with his words, but with his own actions throughout his ministry and his life. Jesus, he doesn't call his followers to escape the world. He places them within it. He's saying that losing saltiness is all about your ineffectiveness, not about your flavor. And that's the part that gets misunderstood the most, I think, because in the ancient world, salt was often mixed with other minerals, so much so that if it was mixed a little too much and it became a little too diluted, it would still look like salt, but it would have no ability to preserve anymore. So when Jesus says, if the salt loses its saltiness, he's not talking about personality or boldness or ability to speak. He's talking about salt that no longer does what it is meant to do. Think presence without influence, association without distinction, visibility without substance. That's why he says it's good for nothing. Jesus, he's calling his followers to live close enough to the world to slow decay without becoming part of the decay themselves. He doesn't call them to impress. He doesn't call them to shame. He doesn't call them to take over the world, but he calls them to preserve and restrain and bear a faithful influence within the world for the kingdom. Salt doesn't shout. Salt doesn't shout. It stays. Over time, it makes a difference. Now think about light. For us, we use lamps, especially in our house. I remember going to this antique store not very long ago, and my wife's looking at me like I'm going to be in trouble for sharing this story. But we went to this antique store not long after we moved here, I think. And she found this beautiful lamp, and she said, and it could just be used as a decoration. We don't even have to plug it in. And I said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And anyway, I got my way because that lamp is now plugged in and it's used every day. But that's okay. We use lamps and lights as decoration. But in ancient times, they weren't decorative. Sure, they might have had gold or they might have had silver or platinum or something around them, but they weren't meant for decoration. It was necessary, light was, for life. It was rare and it was valuable, and it was impossible to ignore once it was present. There wasn't an ambient glow of the street lights that we have. I talked to several weeks ago about how when we went out to see the Northern Lights, we didn't get far enough away from the street lights, right? There weren't light switches anywhere. Light, it meant safety, it meant direction, and it meant truth. It meant that life would continue in the space that light was in. So darkness, it wasn't just this spooky little thing that's portrayed to little kids nowadays. It was actually dangerous. Jesus, he's saying that light, it reveals reality. It doesn't create it, though. It doesn't invent truth. It exposes a truth that is already there. Now, darkness, it hides obstacles and it hides threats. It hides reality. Light reveals what's actually happening. It reveals where danger is, and what does light do to the danger? Think of going camping. Now, listen, I don't do this, so I might be speaking for myself, but why do you keep a fire somewhat lit at night if you're in the wilderness? To keep animals away, right? Or am I just making that up? Okay. To put it simply, light doesn't argue with darkness. It shows what is real. Light works by being seen, not absorbed. That's the absolute opposite of what salt is. Salt works best when it absorbs and blends in. Light works best when it's on, when it's visible. Jesus says a city on a hill can't remain hidden, and that a lamp under a bowl has no point, right? Light that hides itself still exists, but it fails its purpose. So Jesus is pushing his followers to public faith. He's pushing his followers to noticeable obedience and a life truly worth watching, worth paying attention to. It doesn't have to be performative, but it definitely has to be visible. An easy way to be distinctive between salt and light is this. Salt, it influences quietly, but light, it influences openly. Light doesn't have to be loud, it just has to be transparent, right? God, he places his people close enough to slow decay and visible enough to expose the truth. Jesus, he doesn't give the church a mission, he gives it an identity. The truth is that we see that analogy and we tend to separate the influence of salt from the visibility of light. And just think back to Star Wars. I know you guys came to church thinking, I can't wait to hear this sermon about Star Wars. Because in the beginning, Chancellor Palpatine, that's what he was a senator, then a chancellor, then ultimately the emperor. He doesn't seize his power in the open. He influences from the shadow. And the problem isn't that he has influence. It's that his influence is never exposed to the light. See, most of us are comfortable with influence as long as it stays quiet. What makes us uncomfortable is being seen. Palpatine, he is the perfect example of influence without visibility. He shapes outcome while hiding his true allegiance. Jesus says that kind of hidden influence is not how his kingdom works. Most Christians, they struggle to hold influence and visibility together. We choose one and we avoid the other, but Jesus, he assumes both. If you turn to Daniel 6, we see a biblical picture of faithful presence. Now, as you're turning there, I'll remind you of Daniel's situation. Babylon had taken over Jerusalem and had taken many of the young people from the noble families, the men, handsome, intelligent, and otherwise qualified to serve the king's court. And from the tribe of Judah, he took the likes of Daniel, he took the likes of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men all faced challenges that attempted to pull them away from their God, yet they stood through fire, both figuratively and literally. And before we jump into this text, we will see that something similar has happened with Daniel here. Now, some of the people King Darius appointed to lead came up with this plan to get rid of a blameless guy like Daniel. They tricked Darius into issuing this decree that would say that for the next 30 days that nobody was to be worshipped within the city of Babylon except for Darius. And the leaders knew that they had trapped Daniel because of his previous convictions to God and to what his ultimate calling was. And so they lead Darius into this trick to get rid of one of his best servants. And that's where we're going to jump in verse 16. So the king, he gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Does that sound familiar to the story of the fiery furnace? At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in, and they were thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and their children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions had overpowered them and crushed all of their bones. That's dark. See, even in the wake of potentially losing everything, life included, Daniel prayed just as he had done before the decree. He doesn't posture, he doesn't protest. His faith influences where he plants his flag. His faith influences where he plants his flag. His obedience becomes visible without self-promotion. But in his faithfulness, Daniel was spared by God. The text says the mouths of the lions were sealed shut. Daniel was absolutely innocent of everything he had been accused of. He refused to bow down to the quiet influence of the leaders, and his faithfulness was visibly noticed, especially in this defining moment. The king, who had everything that you could ever desire, refused to eat. He refused to be entertained because he was so anguished by the fact that one of his best people, this faithful man to the king, might have perished. We see the end of the people who want to pull all of the strings from the shadow. The king had them thrown into the den, and they couldn't even hit the ground before the lions had gotten to them and crushed them. See, Daniel, he didn't seek attention, but faithfulness always eventually becomes visible. And that is salt before light. But what do influence and visibility actually look like? I think it's important to note that light itself is not just this volume, right? If a place is dark, even the smallest of light can make a difference. We think about that. A city on a hill, it can't be hidden, even if the lights are dim, right? Because the hill's still up there. It's also important to note that salt isn't withdrawal. We think, if these people are corrupt, I shouldn't be around them. If my best friend since 5th grade, after we graduated, they went down this wrong path, I'm not going to associate with them anymore. I'm not going to check up on them. If this person doesn't have the same ideals that I have, I shouldn't associate with them. We see that going on just a couple hundred miles, like northeast of us, east-northeast of us right now, right? But salt has to be present to work. Salt, it doesn't preserve a steak by sitting on the shelf. It has to be close enough to touch it and to mix in with it to keep the steak from decaying, right? When Jesus calls us the salt of the world, he's not calling us to withdraw from the world. Salt that sits on the shelf, it doesn't preserve anything except maybe your wallet, because you don't have to go to the store to get more salt, right? At the same time, salt, it doesn't stop being salt. It stays distinct, but it stays close. Jesus calls us to faithful presence, close enough to slow decay, but distinct enough to make a difference. Our good works are ordinary obedience lived openly. Ask yourself these questions this week if you want to write these down. Where has God already placed me? Where has God already placed me? Who are the people experiencing my presence regularly? Who are the people experiencing my presence regularly? Co-workers, kids, students, spouses. If I were to ask those people, would they say Christ is recognizable in my life? Friends, we don't shine. We don't shine by stepping on the stage. We shine by living faithfully where God has already planted us. The last thing I thought of this week was the purpose of mission, and I think the answer is right there in verse 16, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Church, our mission has to end in God's glory. Here's the truth. Your visibility is absolutely about recognition, but it's not your own. Does your visibility, does your Christ-like character and obedience, does it stop people in their tracks to where they recognize, wow, that person knows Jesus? Because if your visibility stops people in their tracks and they recognize, yeah, you know, Will's actually really cool, that is not good enough. Remember, Jesus mentions that the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Your influence prepares the ground. The harvest is still plentiful. Your light reveals the source. The harvest, it's still plentiful. When Jesus shapes your life, the world isn't only noticing you, it's noticing Him. You know the thing I love about Star Wars, back to Star Wars again, it's that it does this really, really good job of contrasting light and dark. We have Palpatine, again, who is revealed to be the big bad of the entire series, and he manipulates everyone from the Senate all the way to the man who would become Darth Vader. But out of nowhere comes this little orphan boy known as Luke Skywalker. He doesn't set out to control anyone. He doesn't manipulate systems. He doesn't build a platform. He stays close to the good. He resists corruption even when it's the most enticing, most tempting option. He chooses faithfulness to the good, to the light, over the power of the dark side. And without trying to dominate, without trying to rule the galaxy, he becomes a light within it. Hopefully you see a gospel connection here before I keep nerding out. Luke doesn't change the galaxy by force. He changes it by who he becomes by the force inside him, and that's, for us, that's the Holy Spirit. That's exactly what Jesus is saying. We influence the world so that Christ is visible in us, not by control, not by volume, but by lives shaped by the right source. And I'm not just talking about some movie franchise. I'm talking about our mission as disciples of this Jesus who we follow. Jesus isn't calling us to be impressive. He's calling us to be faithful. He doesn't end this teaching by telling us to do more. He tells us to be who we already are. You are salt. You are light. So the question we have to ask isn't, am I loud enough or am I impressive enough? But the question is, where has God already placed me and what is my presence doing there? It's okay to be close to the world, but we can't lose our distinction from it. Others of us are distinct, but we choose to stay hidden in the world. And Jesus isn't calling us to choose one or the other. He's calling us to hold both. Faithful presence, visible obedience. If you've realized this morning you've been influencing quietly, but hiding your allegiance to Jesus, this is your moment to stop hiding. If you've been visible without substance, this is your moment to return to the source. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your son Jesus, who is the source of all life, as we talked about in Sunday school this morning. We're so grateful for the suffering that he endured so that we can live here and that we can be present and be in the world but not of the world, in a way that we can slow the decay of godlessness. Help us to be the light that guides people home to Jesus, that guides people to the foot of the cross where Jesus paid everything. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.
If you would like to stand, we're going to sing hymn number 544, Without Him.